Growing up, I used to love talking about my dad. At one point, he was all I talked about. I was just so proud of him and used to love bragging about him. But wouldn't you do it as well if your dad was an astronaut? An astronaut is one of the most respected and admired jobs, in my opinion. When I was a child, I always wanted to be one. Hell, I think at one point or another, most of us have dreamed about the idea of going to space and just see what's out there. See how to get there. Just see what it's all about. It's something so marvelous yet so scary. It's so unique. It's not something that most people get to do. And so I was glad I could be related to someone who had that amazing opportunity. Space was Dad's favorite place, and unfortunately, it was the place where he died. For many, many years, I knew about Dad's greatest stories because he used to tell them to me. I remember sometimes he would just be gone for long periods of time, and then he would come back with a whole bunch of pictures and presents. Whenever Dad stayed at home with us, I wanted to spend all the time hearing what he had to say. I thought I knew all about him and his life, and I loved him more than anything. And that's why it hurt so much when he passed away. He died in 2000 when I was 10 years old. It was all very sad and frustrating, but the worst thing for me was that I had zero details about my dad's death. I remember one day some men in uniforms came to our house and spoke to my mother. Mom told me to go play in my room, not to go out until she said so otherwise, or I'd be in trouble. I remember being in my room for over 2 hours. I know exactly how long it was because I kept looking at the clock because I just wanted to go to the toilet, but I couldn't because I'd been told not to do so. I lived in a very strict house. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore, and I just had to leave the room. When I did, I had to go past the living room where my mom and the men were talking. They all looked at me, and I could tell my mom had tears in her eyes. "I think we're done here. Please contact us if you have any requests, Mrs. Smith," the men said before leaving. I ran to my mom and asked what was happening, and that's when she told me my dad had passed away. At the moment, I didn't ask her how he died. It just didn't occur to me asking that. I was just in so much grief. I was so shocked after that I barely spoke for the next year, and I had problems with depression. However, when I started talking again, I asked my mom what had happened to my father. All she said was that he died of natural causes. I asked if he had died in space because I knew that he was supposed to be in one of those trips to the space station, where he was normally sent. She said no, and I insisted, saying that he was supposed to be at the space station, and Mom replied by saying he had already come back before he died. I wanted to ask her more, but she shut me down, and basically that's what happened throughout all of my teenage years. I would constantly ask Mom about details related to Dad's last trip and his death, but she just never answered or gave me yes or no answers. I did think it was weird, but eventually I stopped asking because I came to the realization that talking about it hurt her. Well, at least that's what I thought back then. But a couple of years ago, I realized that the reason why she didn't speak about it was because she couldn't. Fast forward many years later. So, a couple of years ago, my mom and my stepfather went away for vacation and asked me if I could stay in their house since I didn't have any plans and they needed someone to watch over their dogs. I agreed and everything was pretty normal at first. One day, however, there was a storm that hit the city, and it affected our neighborhood, but it wasn't that strong yet to evacuate. However, we did have some problems like power failures and other things such as flooding. I was trying to save my cell phone batteries in case of a real emergency. So, without any technology, I was pretty bored. And that's when I started feeling a certain curiosity, I guess you could say. You see, after my father died, my mother didn't like me going into her room or lurking around her things, which I get. I mean, many moms don't, but mine was pretty cool with it before. Whenever I asked her why, she said it's just because she didn't want me sneaking into my stepfather's gun collection, but I knew that was a lie. She didn't meet my stepfather until 3 years after my father's death, and he moved in with us a year later. Anyways, whatever the reason was, I was curious and wanted to check everything around. And so I started opening the closet where the gun collection was. It was not all that new to me because he had shown me his guns before. I then looked at the other closets and chests until, at the back of my mom's closet, I found a very strange looking box. The box was rather big and was decorated with the symbol of my dad's space station. And that's when I knew that it belonged to him. I was astonished. I just didn't understand how my mom could have hidden this from me for all these years. I mean, after all, she knew how much Dad and his job meant to me. And after he died, all I had from him was a couple of his shirts and some pictures. So I opened the box. I found that it had some medals that were given to my dad after his death. Something that I didn't know about. Yeah, a couple of pictures and some diaries. I started checking every diary, and it was Dad's handwriting for sure. At the beginning of every book, it said, "To my beloved boy, Adric, from Papa." I started flipping the pages and soon learned that the books were my father's journals. Each journal was from one of his trips training, and from his space trips. He had been in space a total of 2 times. I was so excited to read the diaries. However, I couldn't read them in their respective order. I had this urge to read from my dad's last diary. I just had this feeling that reading the last diary will clear my doubts about his death. Dad's diary started pretty normal, saying how excited he was about going back to space, etc. However, he did express to have a bit of anxiety regarding the space station he was at. Dad's space station was rather peculiar. It was supposed to work only a few years, but it ended up working much more than that. I mean, it sounds pretty cool, but things were not all that perfect. There were some issues with it, basically. There were some failures in it. Some things could be repaired, and some others not. We're not talking about the ISS International Space Station, oh no. We're talking about a secret government space station. One that I would soon learn about. Anyway, it was supposed to be the last trip they would have before they shut the space station down. For this specific trip, Dad traveled with 5 other people. Mikkel, Angelo, Calvin, Dimitri, and Francois. All of them knew each other from either certain trips or training. Dimitri, the co-pilot, was one of Dad's best friends, and I also remembered him a lot from when he came to our house and visited us. The first part of his journal was pretty normal and mundane. Dad spoke about how surreal it was to be there, how little and insignificant everything seemed, including his own existence. Dad explained how this particular time things were harder to enjoy because some of them lived in constant stress due to some of the things going on in the ship. He explained that there was a very random smell around. The place had a smell before due to certain damage in some circuits, but this smell was completely different. According to him and his friends, it smelled like ashes. The other thing they said, that the smell was not constant. It came and went every other day. There were a couple other issues happening this time. Dad and his friends complained that sometimes they would feel a buzz in their ears. which wasn't a strange thing to happen out there, but the strange thing is that they all felt this at the same time. And this went on for about 2 days or so. So one day, Dad and most of the guys were hanging out together, except Angelo, who was sleeping, and Calvin, who was working in one of the rooms. Apparently, Dad and his friends had smelt that smell again, followed by the sensation in their ears. This time, the sensation was so much stronger it gave them a headache. The buzz was almost unbearable and was also difficult to explain. So they went to the control room to try to report it, when they noticed a lot of their communication equipment wasn't working. They noticed how bizarre this was and wondered what they should do. Dad and Dimitri considered this was the reason to try to send an SOS, but MacCallum and Francois were unsure of what to do, so they decided to go find Calvin, who was the main person in charge. As they walked to the sleeping quarters, the buzzing got worse. But that's not it. The door was locked, which was not unusual, but what was completely unusual was the fact that on the other side of the room, there were shiny and white lights. They didn't know what this was all about, so they tried opening the door, but nothing. And so they started to knock and scream Calvin's name, but nothing seemed to work. The intensity of the light and the sounds became worse as their desperation grew. And all of a sudden, the light disappeared and so did the buzzing, and they were able to open the door. But when they did so, they couldn't find Calvin in the room. The only thing that they could see was a crystal vial containing ashes floating in the middle of the room. Before they had time to discuss where the thing came from, the buzzing started again, and they heard a strong sound. They immediately looked at each other and without saying a word, knew that they had to go check on Angelo. They tried to rush in order to get there, when they saw Angelo trying to make their way to them. He looked terrified as if he had seen a ghost. But before he could tell them what had happened, the light was behind him. And it was just not a simple light. The light was nothing but a reflection coming from a tall creature. The creature was slightly gray, and it had eyes and a sharp head. But there was not much more Dad could notice, since it was so bright and blinding. The next thing he knew, this creature extended his arm pointing at Angelo with his 3 fingers, and in a matter of seconds, Angelo basically became pulverized. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but found himself trying to go to the place where he hid whenever he wanted some time for himself. Dad made it to his hiding spot and saw this creature turning Francois into a crystal. He doesn't recall anything happening to his best friend Dimitri, but he felt guilty for leaving him behind. Dad said in his journal that he noticed the creature emitted the buzz and the lights, and since he still felt the buzz, he knew he could not go back out to look for his friend. And so that's when Dad grabbed his journal and began writing what I'm telling you now. Dad wrote everything he saw as detailed as he could. He also took his time to write to Mom and me, tell us how much he loved us. Dad wrote that after a couple of hours after the buzzing stopped. So then he went to look for Dimitri and tried to send an SOS. He took his journal with him in order to write what he saw. He said everything looked very normal until he got to the main control area. That's when he found 4 of the odd-looking crystals that contained ashes. The moment he saw them, he knew what they were. He quickly contacted ground control, although he didn't manage to tell them all that had happened, and he quickly wrote these last details to me. In fact, the last thing Dad wrote was, "Never travel to space." After reading that, I felt devastated. But the worst part was when I found a crystal vial among the things in the box. When I saw it, my heart dropped. I couldn't help it. I had to call my mom immediately. I needed to know if that crystal contained the ashes of my dad. My mom didn't answer me over the phone, but eventually she flew back home to talk to me. She apologized to me for not letting me know the truth, but she also told me that part of it was because she had promised not to do so. When I asked her who made her promise that, she said, "Do you remember the men who came to see me that day?" She also told me her silence was part of a deal. She said that due to the circumstances, they couldn't disclose that information to the public. She was also given a very good amount of money that helped towards many things like my college and other things like cars and stuff. Mom said that by the time the help arrived, they found 6 crystals with ashes and nobody around. But thanks to what my dad wrote, they found out what happened. The only reason why they think this crystal was my dad's was because they found it right next to his journal. I know I probably shouldn't be saying anything, but I can't help it. I want to tell my dad's story, a story that has been very well hidden. There's no information about him or his friends anywhere. It's like it was all erased. Also, I want people to know that we're not alone, and perhaps to raise the question, should we really keep going to space?